Hi, I'm Ryan North.
I'm Lori Fungi.
And I'm Shawn Wilson. You're listening to Foster Family Matters, a production of CK Family Services, people united through God to enhance the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of at-risk children and families. Welcome back to Foster Family Matters. Lori, Ryan, how are we doing today?
Doing well. How are you, Shawn?
Fine, thank you, Shawn.
I'm doing really well. We got our cadence out just a bit there, but that's okay.
I don't know if I was supposed to pause for you to answer or say hello first.
Or be offended that I didn't ask how you were?
No, I'm not offended. I'm used to it.
There's no offense here.
Never in this room.
There are fences. No walls, just fences. So today we're talking about trauma, and I really think that today's episode is going to feel like, for many of you, as a foundational episode. We're going to, as this podcast progresses, really dive into trauma in a lot of facets. There's probably going to be multiple episodes that we do in the future that will send people back to this episode as kind of a foundational point of reference and context for what we mean when we talk about trauma. Do you guys have anything to add to that before I jump into a good old-fashioned definition?
I don't think so.
I don't either. And kind of buckle your seatbelt, because Shawn's right. This will be a foundation, and Ryan, Shawn, and I have high hopes to take this in a lot of different avenues to really help solidify what this means. What does this look like in the flesh in your homes? What does this mean for you as an adult, or maybe even the professionals in your home? So this is kind of just a taste of all the different directions that we can actually take this, and that we really plan and are excited to take it in the future, in future podcasts.
So Merriam-Webster.com defines trauma as an injury, such as a wound, to living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent, a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury or an emotional upset. And so here's a fun fact. Did you know that the word trauma is actually a Greek word that means wound? You know, early Greeks used this word pretty much exclusively to describe physical wounds. So, I suppose if you came back from battle, you would have experienced trauma, but it might be that your arm was lobbed off. But in modern context, trauma has also come to be used to define emotional wounds, and so I thought that was an interesting way maybe to start off this episode. Yeah.
So the real problem with this topic is, I think you could just hit record and we could sit here for the next 10 hours. And then you could have to edit that into 20-minute segments, Shawn. So all of a sudden that seems very appealing to me, Lori.
Let's do it.
Give Shawn some more work. But I think one of the things that really helped me with my kiddos was understanding the idea that trauma is personal, right? And so one of the ways that I remember that is my wife and I were puppy parents before we were actual parents. Mm-hmm. And our trajectory was, okay, after we got married, we got a house plant. And if the house plant didn't die, we were going to get a pet. And if the pet lasted 2 years, we were going to become parents.
I appreciate the progression.
And we not the other way. That was, we had that conversation. We did that. And I remember having a ficus tree that everybody used to have in their living rooms.
Succulents never die.
Succulents never die.
Challenge accepted. I'm almost certain I have murdered many a succulent.
Succulents never die sounds like the name of a rock and roll album from a band from Denton.
Hey guys, I'm pretty sure we can't say succulent never dies. I'm pretty sure there's a trademark on that. It's part of the James Bond series.
Anyhow, center face. The way that I remember that, though, is we had these dogs before we had kids, and one of them died in the summer of 2016, and some of our kids, it was just horribly distressing, right? They wept. It was like biblical type mourning for some of our kids. It was for me too. I just absolutely loved those two dogs. But for some of our kids, they're like, "What's the big deal? The dog just died." And for either of those responses to sit in judgment of the other response would be wrong, because I don't get to say what impacts you and to what level it impacts you. Because when we talk about sexual abuse, physical abuse, you see a kid whose arms have been broken, we can, that's obvious. But there are other kinds of trauma that aren't as obvious, and for us to be dismissive of those things is a really, 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 really big disservice to the children.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it takes, when I think of trauma, I tend to take it personally too, because it's such a subjective nature. There's such subjectivity to it, and that you deal with it personally and it affects you personally, and how you deal with it is what's a part of your makeup. And so for me, losing my mom, it was February 20th, 2011, and it was unexpected, it was sudden, and it was incredibly tragic and traumatic how it happened. Now I have two older sisters, and the three of us were there in the room, and we were walking her through it. It was only a couple of days from the moment she was in the hospital to the moment that she passed. And looking an aerial view of how the three of us dealt with that and experienced that loss was starkly different. And here the three of us, so closely knit and growing up, we would say that we're each other's best friends, very enmeshed, maybe a little too much. Stay tuned for that podcast. And yeah.
Lori unpacks her history. Coming to an episode near you.
But for the three of us, we experienced it really differently, and we had different memories, and different things were hardest for each of us in just a different way. And I think that's really poignant to look at the emotional aspect and the physical aspect of what comes with emotional trauma, because there are some physical repercussions and implications that come with it as well. And so I love how you said that it's personal. I think it's really important that we be mindful of that for every single person in our family, including ourselves as the parent, as the mom, as the dad, and then our kiddos if we have bios in the home, and then if we have kiddos from the system in the home.
I have a friend who says trauma has a face. That's how she remembers that it's personal. All traumatic experience is a face associated with it, and if you can look into that face, a lot of your resistance to being the kind of person that child needs drops immediately, because it's not just a theoretical concept that happens to other people out there. It's real and it's personal.
So I love that you guys have started it out this way, and I have a question, as I so frequently do when I hear you guys speak on.
You're a seeker of understanding.
I am, and clarification.
Yeah.
So I think what I hear maybe intertwined in what you're saying is that trauma isn't necessarily something that other people get to define for you. Like your trauma is your trauma, regardless of whether the world views it as trauma or not. And that's kind of to the point when we're parenting kids who have experienced trauma, right? Is that I think frequently myself as a parent, I come to parent my own children, and I bring my definitions to parenting them, and I have to take a step back and kind of, pack those away for a moment and hear them tell me how their experience was trauma.
Spot on, Shawn. Absolutely.
Yeah. I agree with that. Spot on. Absolutely. Because it does impact people differently. Because your previous experience influences how this experience reacts, right? And so sometimes something, depending on how resilient a person is, it can make them stronger, and the next experience is something they can deal with differently, or it can really re-traumatize them on a different level, and the next experience is something that impacts them far worse. One of the things when we talk about trauma and understanding trauma is in adoption, in foster care particularly, the terms like abuse and neglect are real obvious to people as terms of trauma, and there are other risk factors for trauma. But I want to talk about neglect. Sorry, just for a second, if I could. Often we think of neglect as, not often, but we tend to think of neglect, those stories where we find the kids in the dog kennels or locked in the closets where they aren't fed and things like that. And so neglect has almost become exclusively physical neglect in people's minds. But Harvard, and we can put a link to this in the notes, Harvard did some research on neglect, and there's a video called The Science of Neglect, and it's such an epidemic in our culture now. And so, for a child that was raised in a nurturing, loving home, this can still have impacts. But when you consider a child that comes from a traumatic history that has been removed from their birth family and placed into a foster home, something as simple as when that child wants to ask you something and you won't stop your scrolling through Facebook or Instagram or responding to a text or your email, something really innocuous, what that child may hear is, I'm not as important as what's going on there. And so for kids with compromised belief systems already, understanding that you might not be as important has lifelong impacts, right? I was raised in a home where I really felt like I had to compete for my parents' attention constantly. As a result of that, I struggle in relationships as a 43-year-old adult, because when somebody does something, so I'll make it super personal. If my wife does something, I don't go, oh, she's just doing that. The voice in my head goes, oh, she chose something else.
She's doing it to you.
Yes, and that's the real problem with trauma, is it really influences that inner narrative if you don't deal with it.
Yes. And two things that I want to mention. The first one, you kind of differentiated between children that come from maybe a chaotic upbringing or have been exposed to abuse and neglect for a while. And that while may be 1 month or it may be 3 years, but it develops into what we know as complex developmental traumas or complex trauma. And the other hand of that is just a simple trauma or a situational trauma. It's kind of it could be a one-time thing. Losing my mother, yes, it was incredibly traumatic, but we were so close growing up that I didn't have a traumatic upbringing to the extent that I would have experienced complex developmental issues because of that trauma. However, after losing her, several things shifted for me, sensory-wise, physiologically. I used to be incredibly spontaneous. Now I need a little bit more predictability because I lost her so suddenly and it was so unexpected. I used to be able to walk into a room and crowds didn't bother me. Now I kind of tend to shy away from situations like that. Really oddly, I can't stand the sound of people chewing now. After my mom died, I can't stand that sound. So there is a sensory implication where my brain is now wired just a tad differently because of that loss. And that's what trauma does. And so if we look back and specifically in the kiddos that we serve, what I experienced for years, I prayed and I said, Lord, just please make beauty from ashes. And I will never forget the day just feeling overwhelmed with so much peace and solace. And I could feel him and hear him in my spirit, not audibly, but I heard what you experienced is just a glimpse of what the kiddos you love and you serve have gone through every day. And so take that and use it and help to equip and help to empower. And so yes, I experienced that, but it also shed so much light, so much subjective light that I could really understand and know what it meant for our kiddos to experience what they've been through. And there pales in comparison. It just...
Well, and so I think it's important, though, that as you say, it pales in comparison, that everybody's trauma almost kind of exists in a vacuum.
Right.
And one of the things that my mother ingrained in my mind over and over and over as I grew up is don't compare yourself to others.
So true.
Right. And I laughed at that because it seems like everything in our society is a competition. But when it comes to helping our children or even helping ourselves, our spouses, our friends with the trauma that they've experienced in their life, I think it's important that we isolate it from the context of other folks' trauma, because for that person, it's the only trauma that matters in that moment, right?
Absolutely. And as you're saying that, the thought of not comparing, but differentiating between resolved and unresolved. And I think that's the separation, is that after my mom's death, to get to this place of a lot of self-care, a lot of extra help, a lot of support and love and nurturing from those around me, and doing things that I needed to get back to a level of functioning again, and to give myself freedom and permission to understand God's will and intent. I mean, all the things that you go through gets you hopefully to this place of being resolved from that trauma. And that's not so easy for some of us. I was able, and it's an ongoing process. Will always work through that trauma as long as I'm being proactive and positive in the way that I'm doing it. And I think the difference is that our kiddos aren't in a place of resolve yet. And so much of our job is being a part of that process for them.
Yeah, I'm love that you introduced the word unresolved into this conversation, because while there is complex trauma in itself is complex, right? Because even like if you think of you have a splinter in your finger, well, if you don't remove the splinter, it will fester around it.
Right.
Well, issues are like that too, right? So even something that we would say is an adverse experience, something not quite that great, which we might agree that's not really, we would not classify that as traumatic. But if we leave those little things unresolved, like perhaps you grew up in a home where your parents favored one of your siblings over you.
Sure. Or my parents divorced.
Or I would say that I wouldn't have gotten divorced though, because that's like a big traumatic event. I mean, it's something as simple as the parent chooses the one child over the other more often than not. If you leave that unresolved, this is the way that kind of makes sense to me. So there's one piece of pizza left. Pizza is delicious, unless, of course, you're gluten and dairy free, then it's of the devil. But for people who can eat gluten and dairy, it's delicious, okay? I know that because half of my house is gluten and dairy free. And so if you have one piece of pizza, which you just enjoyed for dinner now, but you stick it and shove it to the back of the fridge and you don't notice it, 2 weeks later, when you pull it out, it's going to be green and furry and make you sick if you eat it. Right. That's the problem with leaving things unresolved, is that over time, something that was probably maybe not that bad becomes a bigger and bigger issue because you left it unresolved. That's why, the Bible talks about keeping your accounts short. And this part specifically for parents now, right? Do not create more traumatic experiences in your life or in your child's life because you'll just say, we don't need to talk about that. I think it's healthy and I'd like to walk that back, and I don't want you to edit that out. I know it is healthy to talk about stuff, and we can have a whole episode on the positive impacts to your physical brain of actually talking about stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I think that it's so complicated, the subject, because it is unresolved things that over time become big issues. Because one by itself is not a big number, but if you keep adding one to itself 1,000 times, you end up with a pretty big number.
Right, which is typically, more times than not, our kiddo story.
Yeah.
That it's just, it was one, and then one turned into two, and then two over time turned into 20.
Yeah.
And so it's one thing to have a mother who's working late to put food on the table, which means that her hours are from 5 p.m. to 4 in the morning, and you don't get to see her. So now you're being raised by maybe extended family or caregivers or people that you may not know very well. Turns into potential drug abuse, alcohol abuse, whatnot, new strangers, sexual encounters. It can progress, and we've seen it in our kiddos. And so I think the hardest thing for some of our families is that we don't know the facts. And my encouragement, or maybe even my rebuttal to that, is enough, and that the trauma is there.
Yeah, that's really, really, really good. One thing that I like to tell parents is if you will help your children resolve their traumas, or at least not maybe get to an ultimate place of resolution, but at least make that the trajectory of their lives. It's not just all of those physical things you talked about, sex, drugs, alcohol, mental health issues, but our kids don't know how to connect in meaningful relationship with people, right? That's why being connected to a healthy, competent, caring, available caregiver who doesn't give up on them is so crucial. And I told a group of parents recently, look, as you keep working with your children to be the agent of healing in their lives and help them process their histories, you are literally divorce-proofing their marriages right now. Because
Potentially.
Potentially. But obviously, you make
that's the hope.
Camels through the eyes of needles statements in front of people, right? That is the hope, though, because what I do know is, that's a grandiose statement. But what I do know that if we help our kids process their traumas, we at least set them up to have success in relationship, as opposed to, I can't engage in a hard thing. So the first time my marriage hits a road bump, you check out. Now, I don't know about you, but the person I least like in the world is the one who checks out. And my wife used to check out and I used to engage. And the first 5 years of our marriage was what's the word I'm looking for that's safe to say? Volatile, maybe?
Tumultuous?
Caustic?
I'm going to go volatile mostly because I don't think I know
Caustic
what those two
got
words
a little,
mean.
that could have amped it up a little bit.
Because we didn't understand ourselves.
Sure.
We didn't understand how to relate in relationship to each other. And so that's why it's not just, when you're a parent and you're struggling, you just want the behaviors to change. But that's not the real mission that you've been called to. The mission you've been called to is to set the child up to change the trajectory of the child's life, and so that they could engage in all future relationships in meaningful ways. Because we can actually change the way people relate to one another if we'll help them heal.
Absolutely. And talking about relating, this kind of goes in sync with that in terms of, we do say abuse and neglect, and these feel like really big things because they are very big evils. And they're especially evil when we see them happening to young, defenseless children, right? And I think that's what grates at us and really maybe sets our feet on the pavement of this ministry or this mission that we're doing. And with that, I need us to simplify that the fact that a child is in your home is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, traumatic experiences, and that he's or she's been separated from his or her primary caregiver. Yeah. And going back to, we're not going to know all the facts. We're not going to have all the paperwork, at least as much as we want. We're not going to have all the stories or all the details of their trauma. But I want you to say to yourself, I know this one fact, and this one fact is incredibly traumatic. I know that Johnny is no longer with his mother, and that's all I need to know about that.
So good. Because I think sometimes we discount that, right?
Absolutely.
Because we think, oh, we've changed their address, everything's fine.
Well, and why did my mother's death impact me the way that it did at the age of 31? It was because I was separated from my primary caregiver. Mm-hmm. I mean, that come down to the root of it. That's all that was. Yeah. In addition to all the other things, and how it happened. But the core of it was that even at 31, I don't have my mom.
Yeah.
So the truth, I think, is that there are nearly none of us. Nearly is probably not a word, but
it is today.
It is today. I don't think there's any of us that work or volunteer or participate in the foster care environment that are not in some way impacted by trauma, whether directly or secondarily. Many of us who work in this field, whether we admit it or not, entered the field because we're seeking to heal our own traumas and wounds. And as we learn how to do that, we want to share that ability with others. And God bless all the foster parents that, are confronted and live in the trauma for periods of time with our kids as they're working to resolve the traumas that our children have experienced. I think one of the main points that we want to try to get across in this episode is that trauma is real, and it's systemic within the foster arena.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the reasons that this episode is so important for us to get out, to lay that foundation and kind of a general understanding of what trauma is, and we will branch out in a lot of different ways from this episode as we move forward. Final thoughts. We've got just a couple of minutes left in this episode. Is there anything that you guys really wanted to say about trauma in particular before we close up?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate that if a child comes to you and lets you know that something bothered them, hurt them, troubled them, whatever, don't go.
You're fine.
You're fine. Unless somebody's dying or bleeding, don't bother me.
I don't see a scratch.
You're not scared. Go back to your room.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, none of that. Just get down on their level, look them in the eyes, and just say these wonderful words. How can I help you? Just ask them, how can I help you? And it'll change your relationship with your children. It'll let them know that you are interested in helping them, and it'll also remind you that you're there to help them.
Or even a statement it's not even a question. I'm here for you.
That's right.
So we'll wrap this one up. Thanks again for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to share it with all your family and friends, and even those you don't like. We would love to have them listen to us, and we'll set them straight for you. Maybe you'll start liking them over time.
Good point. I like that.
That's
you like
the plan.
Use this as a weapon to change people.
We are a double-edged sword, my friends.
That's right, we are.
We cut both directions. So with that, thanks so much for listening, and we'll look forward to talking to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.